National strategy includes an internal campaign to rally the people. Often this is a call to personal sacrifice and perseverance in the name of patriotic nationalism. Sometimes the outcome is unknown, sometimes it's neutral, some people would say it's even healthy. Other times, internal strategy turns sinisterly oppressive, spiraling into the abyss, the darkest chapters in human history. Let's explore the strategic phases of genocide when we return. I'm Dr. Christopher Larsen, a veteran of the U.S. Army Infantry, founder of One Shepherd Leadership Institute, and author of Small Unit Tactical Doctrine. Genocide, from Latin gens meaning clan and cero meaning kill, coined by Raphael Lemkin in 1944. 1. The deliberate and systematic destruction, in part or in whole, of an identity group. Regrettably, we have many modern examples of genocide. Even though the term is coined in 1944, there have been genocides throughout history, called by many different things. I believe Winston Churchill called it the act that cannot be spoken of, or something to this effect. But nonetheless, in 1945, Lemkin defined a genocide, and we now look back and recognize that the first modern example of a genocide arguably is the Armenian genocide of 1915 through 17 in Turkey, where the Armenian Christians were persecuted and then exterminated by the Turkmen. And then, of course, the most infamous case, and probably the most egregious case, was the genocide of the Jewish people of Europe, as well as all sorts of other undesirables, as the Nazi party would call them, whether they were gays or dissidents. And again, we're told something in the nature of 6 million Jews and 4 million others were put to death in that genocide. As well, there is the lesser-known Soviet genocide, also carried out by the Nazis in that same time period, and it's estimated that something in the nature of 3.1 million Soviet soldiers and civilian personnel were put to death. And we said never again. The world said never again. But that isn't quite true, because the Khmer Rouge, basically a form of communism, conducted a genocide from 1975 through 79 in Cambodia against its own people. The Rwandan genocide in 1994 took place in Rwanda, and about that same time in the Bosnian genocide took place in 1994 to 96 in former Yugoslavia, what is today called Serbia. And more recently we had the Darfur genocide in 2003 in Sudan. And so there is no indication or reason to believe that we are not very willing as a species to continue with genocide. And I think for that reason, as somber as this topic is, it is pertinent then to look at the stages. That is, there are strategic stages of genocide that have been identified. And so here we'll take a look at the traditional view that really starts with the coining of the phrase there in the wake of World War II and the discovery of what was going on in German-occupied Europe, as well as the Stanton paper view of the stages of genocide. And this paper was developed and written in 1996 by Professor Stanton at George Mason University in Virginia. The traditional view says stage one is to dehumanize a subgroup identity. And that identity can be a political group, it can be a Christian group. Yes, it can be that too. It can be a religious group, it can be an ethnic group. There's really no limitation here. It certainly can be sexual orientation. It's whatever identity group that you can point to, somehow identify, and then start to dehumanize them as a group. The Stanton paper really breaks that same thing down into three steps. It says classification, symbolization, and dehumanization. And what they mean here is that classification is what it sounds like. That subgroup, that identity subgroup, is divided into us versus them. We are this group, they are that group, they are not us. Symbolization means that when combined with hatred, symbols may be forced upon the members of the identity subgroup. We certainly saw that with the Star of David, with Judaism in Europe, Germany occupied Europe. And then dehumanization is what it sounds like. One group denies the humanity of the group. That is, that the empowered group says, well, they're not quite human. So their subjugation and eventually even their extermination, but their subjugation is justified because they aren't us and they don't have our values, and therefore they're not really quite deserving of the title human. That's according to Stanton. And then we go to the next stage, again, traditional view. That's stage 2, and it's the economic subversion of the subgroup. Here again, Stanton papers say, well, it's the organization and polarization. And of course, what they mean by that is that genocide is always organized, claims Stanton, and that special units, militias, whether they're government or paramilitary, are often empowered and armed to start organizing themselves as well as to start subjugating the identified subgroup that's going to be scapegoated for this genocide. And then polarization, hate groups are there's intentional propaganda process here through the polarization. The economic subversion then is a follow-on of those, that organization and polarization. And you can think of things like Kristallnacht. I think that's one night where we say, oh yeah, this is like basically 2 days where they destroyed the Jewish businesses in Germany and Austria. But I think long before it got to that point, that rather infamous incident, you have to understand that signs were up in public squares and parks and schools and businesses saying, no Jews allowed here. And then if you were a non-Jew visiting a Jew business, they would take pictures of you. Those militia and the paramilitary groups would take pictures of you and hang them in a very public space like town halls to show that you weren't abiding, even though you are one of us, you're not abiding by our rules and our norms because you're affiliating with the dehumanized subgroup identity. Then you have the third phase, which is called camp internment of the subgroup. Here again, Stanton papers refer to this as preparation. Victims are identified and separated out because of their ethnic, religious, political, sexual identity, or whatever. And so they are prepared. And of course, what are they prepared for? Well, they're moved into an internment camps or ghettos, sections of the cities or wherever they can manage them. And of course, that's for the extermination. That's all in preparation for the extermination of the subgroup, which is phase 4. Or in the Stanton papers, it's actually 7 and 8. And that is that the extermination is exactly what it sounds like. It's an extermination to the killers because they do not believe their victims to be fully human. So again, when we use the word extermination here, it's very purposeful. It's to say that the killers see this as an extermination of pest, something very much less than human. And then the denial. And the denial is kind of going on, particularly in this last phases, because of preparation and extermination, because of course it's now known. It's an identified phenomenon. The world knows this, and there's great shame with this, so of course we're going to cover up what we can. And so that denial phase is actually, it permeates multiple different phases. These are the 4 strategic phases of a genocide campaign that happens internal to a nation or regions controlled by a specific nation. And again, the traditional view is phase 1, dehumanize a subgroup identity. Phase 2, economic subversion of a subgroup. Phase 3, camp internment of a subgroup. and phase 4 extermination of the subgroup. There's a whole lot more to read about this. I think the Stanton papers are online and certainly worth your while. If you can stomach this sort of thing, certainly not a positive thing to talk about, but one that I think we have to keep foremost of our public discussion, particularly in these perilous times. All right, thanks for joining me.